Hello again, it's Thursday. I think that's January, no, it's Wednesday, and I think that's January 15th, 2013. We're working on the Archduke trio. It's time to flesh out how it all goes together and see if I can remember any of how it feels and how it sounds. Not going to be terribly interpretively complex, but I do want to see what fits under my hand. Stuff that would be a waste of important time to practice at this point. So long as I know that there's no main challenges in it, I'll be able to do just fine in a rehearsal setting. There are little things like that where it's not a difficult thing. I'm not going out of my way to repeat it a number of times. Again, it just requires me to be in the right mindset. Not thinking about talking to you or to myself, but rather making sure that executionally and mentally I'm in the right place. So. And of note is the fact that this is a pianissimo, so I've got to be able to execute it with a sense of ease and elegance. Something that's often forgotten is when you're practicing from the music, the risk is that you don't get visually oriented to what you're doing at the keyboard. So I'm relatively experienced in knowing what I think I'm doing at the keyboard, but something as subtle as this can actually benefit a lot from a little bit of visual input. Spot that I practiced yesterday. Never did put it together, never did do the various iterations, never put the hands together and never put the fragments together. So let's see what happens. I should point out that when you're deciding between hands separate or hands together, sometimes the hands need one another. If you're doing alternating hands, if they are offering cues, mental, musical, physical, to one another, if there's a release that one hand provides or one arm provides the other. In this case, there's enough complexity in the right hand that if I don't feel completely at ease with it, it's a complete waste of time, or the opposite. It's a draining of energy. It's detrimental to the cause if I put hands together before I'm ready for it. Reminder, it's B flat. Now, interestingly enough, just telling myself simple things like it's a B flat arpeggio, and there's a fourth every octave, makes it possible for me to simplify what I'm doing. I looked at the keyboard, I thought about what I was doing, rather than doing what we good sight readers often do, create a short circuit between the music and the body, and have the body respond without thinking a lot about it. That's great when you're sight reading, when you are just trying to flesh out a basic sense of what's going on. When you're really trying to find a transcendental sense of command, of shaping, it's a very bad idea to miss that intermediate step and to not think about what you're doing. So. I can even remind myself that there's a subito piano in the second measure. not great, but at least it's accurate, it's together. I'm not concerned with whether or not the 2 against 3 will work. I know how to play a 2 against 3. I'm not concerned with the tempo yet, because I know I'm just on the edge of feeling good about the passage. And I want to feel good about it at a moderate tempo before I let it go. D major. And then our mixed medium. There where I forgot about a 3rd finger. Stop myself, it's that I didn't have the appropriate thought. Not that I didn't like the execution. I wasn't ready for the right execution because I didn't have the right thought. Here. So the question then becomes, so what will it take to get to a concert tempo and a concert sense of ease? Not mindless repetition, obviously, but mindful repetition, a willingness to stop when I feel that my thinking process is thwarting my ability to execute clearly. Also, feedback from my body. If my body says you're working too hard, or my ear hears that I'm working too hard, I'm working too hard. So, third. I admit to a certain amount of nervousness that you're sitting there watching me, but that's part of it. I think there ought to be somebody inside me also that represents that standard that makes me nervous if I'm cheating, if I'm cutting corners, if I'm doing something like that. I should point out that this Steinway B is an old 20s piano, quite heavily weighted. So when I play on other pianos, typically I don't have the same physical demand placed on me, which in a way is a good thing, because I know if I can accommodate a light, frothy passage on this piano, I can probably deal with it on another piano that's more lightly weighted. Still don't like that. Part of it I note is that when I make too long a demand in time or in space or whatever, then I run the risk of feeling, there's more than I have to anticipate being concerned with. For example, a fuzzy little spot where I need to play third finger when I'm playing a second, an interval of a second. So I want to make sure to have small enough groups or increments to enable me to feel a sense of clarity in my thought and confidence in my gesture. Like, for example, I want to get that far. I don't want to think ahead. So that makes it better. reinforcement of thought that I mentioned yesterday, that I have these three third finger figures in a row. That's it. Third, 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 then I change. So here they start. 2, 3, then the fourth finger one. Here. I'm going to go on. G major, fourth, fourth. I want to just make sure my instincts are correct about what the right notes are. The upper neighboring tone here, the auxiliary note is C natural. Most of us don't like using 5 and 4 a lot. I could certainly do fancy things, but I choose not to right now. It's a question really of making sure that the balance in my hand and my arm are at ease. And the balance has changed and the position has changed based on what kinds of seconds there are. 2 white notes, no big deal, but since the fourth is so much longer, letting myself move back toward my body is significant. Going from a black note to a white note, even more so. By comparison, going from the white to the black note, G to F sharp, it's actually the most comfortable of this group. And I reverse that direction, which makes me think, normally I might do that here too. The other thing I have to decide again is about grouping. That associating this with a reach is not a good idea. I don't want to be in a stretch mode. And in fact, since the accents are on the thumbs, the beats, I would much rather think of the gestures as going to the beats rather than coming from the beats. So I make a little mark in the 2 here, and then here, and then here, and then here, and then here, and there. And so, and it makes it much simpler. I note this to small-handed pianists, for example, when they're playing something like a broken octave. If they think of it as a broken series of sevenths, then their hand can be much smaller. They just have downward sevenths rather than upward octaves. Exactly the same notes, but the mental processing is completely different, and the result is you're much more at ease with a smaller interval than with a larger interval. And similarly here, for me, the descending interval, rather than stressing the biggest distance between notes, stresses the smallest distance. Spend time working out the ideal fingering for this. I have little repeated note fragments. It's slow enough that I could just play it as it falls. time I may do that. Maybe, for example, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1, 3, 2, 1 on the beat. Seems like a good idea. Not an essential idea, just a good idea. So maybe 2, 1, 3, 2, 1. It's just one, you could do this 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 notes. So 2 hand positions, 5 and 4, or 3 hand positions, 3 and 3 and 3. And I see from a previous experience, I like the hand feel of the 3 3s, even though there's one more turn, because I don't have to turn onto a 4th finger. And if I wanted to turn onto a 3rd finger black note, I wouldn't have quite enough fingers. So what works out best for me is 3. Admittedly, this is a 7-note scale too. It's ever so slightly weird. After C major, of course, in scale practice, typically in the right hand, the 4th finger gets to play a black note most of the time. The left hand is rather more unlucky because if it sticks with the right hand, it often has to play 4th finger white notes and make turns on 4th finger and stuff. And singularly unpleasant experience. I see I've put up with it here because I like the simplicity of it. I could make all kinds of fancy things, but what I have discovered, however, is that just because you're at the end of your hand doesn't mean you always want to play 5th finger at the top or bottom of a scale. Some of the time, if you want a particularly strong arrival, you substitute thumb. I'll ponder that. Okay, so get into the bottom of this G major scale. A thumb is in order to make the octave work. Again, the 9th, for those of you who have played this, that has that famous series of 9-note scales, so you have to use 4th twice rather than the standard scale fingering. So that's just a nice thing to know, that the addition of 1 finger gets you where you want to go. So this is just a G major scale. So you have to accommodate for the 1 black note. So that's what I'm doing. A group of 4, and a group of 3. Shift at the end so I can arrive comfortably and change the quality of the sound when I get there. I choose to turn when it gets chromatic at the top to 4th finger in the left hand because it gives me the next 3 chromatics. Because I'll be playing these hands together, and because eyes don't really get to look in 2 different directions at the same time, I probably won't be able to look at both hands simultaneously doing everything they do. So it's to my advantage to know that either or both of these hands can be played without my staring at my hand. So in the case of this, of being aware of how that 4th finger gets to the chromatic on C sharp. Similarly, how my arm accommodates for that black note for the fact that there's movement into the keyboard here. in a way, it's easier to practice this without looking. I'm one group. There we go. My point was that sometimes it's easier to practice without looking because you become more aware of what you're feeling for. Partners get to play the scales. I'm going to trust in the fingering that I worked out here, so from previously. Get my ear used to the dissonances that Beethoven has provided. Because if I don't know what it's supposed to sound like exactly, I'm not guided by what I hear, and I can't pass judgment on whether what I heard is what I want to hear. So. It's a pseudo piano. Whoops. I notice that previously I had reminded myself to not anticipate that B flat, but I couldn't read whether my correction was a B flat or a B natural. And so on, I'll skip a little. I think we will probably take the second ending, at least for now. I've written in the place where Beethoven gets sneaky. It's one of those tongue twistery type things. 3-note descending figure in a 4/4 with groups of 4/16 notes, so you have to know what you're following. Are you following the beaming, the 4 notes together, or are you following the 3 notes? And if so, when he just eliminates one note and creates a 2, you have to be hyper aware of that. So, and then there we go. So. Undulating, repetitive one that lasts a whole beat worth. So, this from yesterday, I have to remind myself where I'm going, because it's so much easier to play this without staring at the music. So, I get that far, come down, and away I go. figurations sometimes fool us. In other words, we play what we think is there, not necessarily what is there. So I have to be very careful not to get suckered in that fashion. I have to make a fingering decision. I can either pick up my hand or turn to second, then adjust. Have this discussion often about whether the term deceptively simple means something looks simple, but it deceives, and underlying it, it's actually more complicated. In this case, these little things that look as if they ought to just fall very nicely still require decisions and awareness. So a reminder that in this case, the skip between the first two notes, which is normally in the hand and part of a fairly closed chord position, is an octave for a change. So octave, that's all it takes is awareness. So octave, saying it doesn't necessarily mean I hear myself. That doesn't make sense. Something to always be aware of. Pagination can really affect your behavior. So if there's a certain change that you never get to practice properly and fluently, duplicate the page or something like that. Or I could trot out my iPad and see maybe a different pagination in a different edition. But if it's going from a C minor, and I keep on with 2, 3, 5, and I go to a D major position, it's probably not in my best interest, or maybe it is, and maybe I just need to pick up my hand, or I could turn my hand. There are so many possible solutions, it's just that I have to have one, and the one has to be reasonable enough. It's not bad. I kind of like it. So, 2, 3, 5, 2, 1, 2. Okay, that repeats. If I were humming my partner's part, the chord changes would make a lot more sense than just playing them in isolation. Okay. C major. Okay. There's an A flat there, which is obscured by my own pencil mark. I know my ear says it's got to be an A flat, but it's silly not to have a graphical reinforcement of that and cause you to doubt when you ought not to. So. I've got a cryptic 3-1 indicated. Don't know what it means. I think it's just in the wrong place. What's that? I I wrote, again, something cryptical. I wrote two hands, which could mean play it as Beethoven wrote it. I may have been experimenting with some kind of finger substitution or hand redivision. I often like, when I'm playing in the left hand, white to black note right above it to reverse the fingering, so the long fingering is to the right. And if I tilt my hand, then weirdly enough, it doesn't feel as if I'm crossing my finger, my longer finger, over my thumb, but rather that my hand is spaced the way the fingers grow on the hand. So that's a very nice solution. Things that have to be practiced are things that really are relatively simple, and so a tendency is to just sort of take them for granted. They need often just a little bit of decision making, a little bit of strategy to make them dependable all the time. So in this case, for example, if I choose to play 5-2 in my right hand on the black-white chord, so long as my awareness is there, I'm fine. If there's no awareness, then I'm taking pot and luck. So I get to choose either. I see I've already chosen beforehand and I rather like it. So I start the second group with the finger that's fingering on those keys, and then I move so that my last 4 notes are under my hand. And then you've got to be careful. So Beethoven ends with single notes. So. Famously awful places where you have a measured trill in the left hand, 16th notes, and you have an unmeasured trill in the right hand, or at least it's written as trill with an upper auxiliary note to indicate it. So is it just an extremely dissonant trill, or is it a trill in the left hand of indeterminate speed? In either event, whenever you have a measured thing in the left hand, it happens that kind of thing. It's the thing that's measured that needs to be listened to. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'm going to take a brief break now that we're in the recap. Oops.